Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's RLI Power Hour titled Corporatization, the Non-Corporate Perspective. Whoops, excuse me. My name is Dr. Jennifer Nathan, and I am co-moderating this evening session with Dr. Pyatt, as we are both co-chairs for the RLI Power Hour webinar series. Before we get started, there's a few logistics items we wanted to run through. So when you logged in this evening, you logged in through the Zoom platform. At the bottom of the Zoom window is the Zoom control panel, and you can see an example of it here. This is the black box that's a Zoom control panel. There are two icons that I want to draw your attention to on the Zoom control panel. The first is the chat icon. The chat icon is what you would use if there's technical issues. If you click on the chat icon, up comes the chat window, and at the bottom is a box you would type in your question or concern, hit submit, and then our support staff will see your question and will then respond to your question and help you resolve your issue. The second icon I want to draw your attention to is the Q&A icon. At the end of this webinar, we will have a Q&A session where you will have the opportunity to ask our speakers questions. You can submit questions at any point during the webinar, but they will not be responded to until we get to the Q&A session. So you can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A icon. The Q&A window will pop up. You'll type in your question, hit submit, and then we will see your question on our end. So just a couple of things I wanted to mention. This webinar is being recorded, and all participant questions will also become part of that recorded webinar. So we do want to make you aware of that. Lastly, the American College of Radiology provides this RLI Power Hour program as an educational resource for attendees. The faculty will offer their individual perspectives, but do not speak for the ACR. We welcome your questions, but faculty and presenters cannot discuss specific prices, fees, or other terms of any specific corporatization-related transactions. We welcome your insights and have to ensure that the ACR and its members stay on the right side of the law. So I am now going to turn things over to Dr. Pyatt to introduce this evening's faculty. Dr. Pyatt?
Thank you, Jen. We have a superb program this evening with three very excellent faculty. Larry Muroff is a MD FACR, is the immediate past president and CEO of Imaging Consultants Incorporated, which has been providing consulting services to radiologists, hospitals, and corporations. He also has a role as an adjunct clinical professor of radiology, both at the University of Florida and the University of South Florida Colleges of Medicine. For 20 years, Larry was a member of a 45+ member group practice where he held several leadership positions, including practice president. Dr. Muroff is an honors graduate of Dartmouth College and Harvard Medical School, where he was selected for Phi Beta Kappa and Alpha Omega Alpha. He is also the recipient of the gold medal of the Florida Radiological Society and the American College of Radiology. Dr. Muroff is listed in Who's Who of America and Who's Who in the World. He is also listed in the publication The Best Doctors in America 2000. His radiology socioeconomic expertise and his educational expertise were recognized in separate cover stories in diagnostic imaging, where he was recognized, and also he was on a cover story for Imaging Economics. Dr. Muroff was designated by Aunt Minnie as radiology's most effective educator in 2010. And he was awarded the 2016 to 2017 Distinguished Career Achievement Award by Dartmouth Medical School. Dr. Larry Muroff has served as president of several national and regional imaging organizations. He is an inaugural member of the board of both the ACR's Radiology Leadership Institute as well as the Harvey Neiman Health Policy Institute. Dr. Muroff has authored more than 80 scientific and socioeconomic articles, and he has presented over 1,100 invited lectures throughout the United States and Europe. Our second speaker this evening is Eric Rubin, MD, FACR. Dr. Eric Rubin is a private practice radiologist who is a partner in Southeast Radiology, which is a private practice radiology group providing services to Crozier Health in suburban Philadelphia. Eric has been a member of the group since 2004 when he completed his abdominal imaging fellowship at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital in Boston. Prior to his fellowship, he completed his diagnostic radiology residency at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia. Eric is a partner in Southeast Radiology and serves on the board of directors. In addition, he is also the first vice president of the Pennsylvania Radiological Society and also serves as chair of the American College of Radiology Human Resources Commission. And he is also a member of the Board of Chancellors of the ACR. Our third excellent faculty tonight is Arvind Vijayasarathi, MD, MBA, and MPH. Dr. Vijayasarathi has completed his radiology residency at Emory University in 2016 and did a neuroradiology fellowship at UCLA in 2017. He possesses a background in public health and business, having earned his MPH from Dartmouth Medical School in 2006 and an MBA from the University of Massachusetts in 2012. Prior to entering his current role as an academic neuroradiologist at UCLA, he was briefly in private practice with a group that was acquired by the largest national corporate entity. This experience sparked a specific interest in the corporatization of radiology. Dr. Vijayasarathi was honored to serve as a member of the ACR's task force on corporatization, and he co-authored the ACR's white paper on this topic. Building on this work, Dr. Vijayasarathi, along with Dr. Dan Ortiz and Dr. Larry Muroff, published a national survey of early career radiologists' perceptions of corporatization in the March 2020 volume of the JACR. He remains closely associated with this topic as he advises graduating trainees during their annual job search. It is quite a pleasure to introduce our first speaker this evening, Dr. Vijayasarathi. Arvind?
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. While I'm pulling up my slides, I just wanted to thank you and Dr. Nathan and the tremendous support staff that we have for making this such a streamlined process and for the invitation to speak. I'm really excited to talk with all of you about this topic because it's of great interest to me. Now, hopefully you should be able to see my full screen. Let me just make sure. Okay. Thanks for that intro. I'm Arvind. I'm one of the academic radiologists at UCLA. Today I'll be talking about my personal experience with corporatization in radiology and really speaking from more of an early career radiologist perspective. I have no financial disclosures. The outline of my talk, so I'll talk about the different practice models and then highlight the independent private practice partnership track model, discuss briefly about corporatization of radiology, and then touch on how early career radiologists seem to feel about the topic. Additionally, and probably the crux of my presentation will be about what can happen when your group sells, and specifically what happened to me in that situation and how it affected me, and maybe some learning points to consider when you're considering your own job opportunities in the future. Okay. So if you're a trainee or you're looking for jobs, you're likely to encounter a number of different practice models. The physician-owned private practice partnership, which is what we'll kind of mostly focus on, is one type, but you're also likely to encounter outpatient imaging center-based employee types of jobs, corporate positions, academic positions, government positions, hybrid positions, health system employee jobs, like in, say, California, for instance, Kaiser or Scripps, a variety of teleradiology positions and locum tenens jobs, all of which have their own unique attributes, some benefits and drawbacks. So the private practice partnership model historically has been the most sought after type of job for graduating trainees. And the way it generally works is there's an initial period in which a new hire is an associate. And usually during that period, they're compensated at somewhat below market pay, but at the same time, they're also probably not as efficient or productive as the existing partners in the group. So during this period, they are definitely growing. Sorry about that. And during this period, you're definitely improving and increasing your productivity. At the end of this period, usually there's a vote amongst the existing, amongst the existing members of the group as to whether or not you would become a shareholder. Whenever this occurs, usually it's predefined in the contract before you join. And then some groups will have a large buy-in, some groups will have more of a modest buy-in, and some groups will have zero buy-in, just kind of that below market compensation for the first few years. It really depends on the equity ownership a group may have in various equipment and imaging centers. And then typically once a shareholder, that new shareholder would have equal voting rights, usually equal ownership stake, some form of equal profit sharing, and then vacation and scheduling commensurate with the other partners. Currently, there are a number of pressures on independent radiology groups, and many of you in practice, I'm sure, experience these on a daily basis. Demand for more rapid turnaround time, 24/7 coverage, weekend coverage, subspecialty reads at all times. And then there's also a lot of uncertainty about the future, things like artificial intelligence, new investment requirements into technology, and then just a variety of reasons to be uncertain about future reimbursements. So at the same time, there's been a substantial interest in the corporate or private equity world into acquiring and aggregating physician groups, and radiology has been a very hot area. And, you know, there's a number of reasons that that's the case, but primarily I think it's because radiology is very fragmented, and also the radiologists themselves don't have a lot of ownership over the patients. So one neuroradiologist can be reasonably replaced with another without a significant drop off. And for members that are in a group, there are a number of incentives to sell your group. And I think that really depends on the demographics of the practice particularly, but if you're maybe within the 10-year retirement age, you know, you have an opportunity to really monetize the growth that's occurred over your entire career. You may have been with a group for 20, 25 years and watched the group grow substantially and increase in value significantly. And it gives you an opportunity to kind of realize that. There's also unique tax benefits to getting a lump sum buyout, and you may not really be too interested in the future outlook of the group 10 years from now. If you're planning on, you know, buying a second home and retiring, there's, you know, not a lot of vested interest you may have. So, you know, my feeling and my perspective is really about what this means to the younger people that are taking on these jobs and that are joining these groups and that are planning to be in a practice for the long haul. So as Dr. Pyatt mentioned, Dr. Muroff and I and Dr. Ortiz surveyed the ACR resident fellow section and young professional section, and tried to get an idea of what young career radiologists' perceptions of corporatization are. And overwhelmingly, we found that you know, early career radiologists prefer to work in independent practices. They generally have a negative perception of corporatization. They desire to be engaged in the business and leadership of their practices. They worry about their group being acquired by a corporate entity. And those that have undergone the process describe a lack of transparency regarding acquisitions. So now, you know, the main part of the talk really is kind of my own experience with it. And this is just all anecdotal. So, you know, as I mentioned before, these are not the opinions of the ACR. These are, you know, just my personal experience to share with people that may go through the same thing, you know, down the road, or learn something from it. So I was interviewing for jobs in 2016. I wanted to return to my hometown in Phoenix, and I had an opportunity to interview with a large private practice there that was stable and very successful with top-tier compensation. I had a friend in the group, and so I was very excited about the opportunity. It was a 3-year partnership track with below market compensation during that time, and a reasonably modest buy-in once you become partner. But the long-term financial implications were very good, and the outlook was very strong. The group was continuing to grow. They had great management, great IT, and just were kind of a well-oiled machine operating independently. So I was very excited, you know, about the opportunity. when I finished fellowship, I joined the group in 2017, and it was a very, very highly productive group. I think the average somewhere around 95 RVUs per day. So it's not a it's very productivity focused, but the quality of the reads was still very strong. So for me, that required definitely a transition, and I had to really pick up my speed after graduating training, as I think all trainees have to at a certain point. But at first, the calls were definitely difficult. But over time, I think I started to adjust to it and brought in my skill set to kind of doing things I hadn't done before, reading types of cases I hadn't read before, and just trying to kind of fill that role and meet the group's needs and meet the clinicians' needs, and ultimately take care of the patients that we served. But unfortunately, just a few months after I joined, I got an email, which basically was a communication to all the employees. And it just said that, our group was joining Radiology Partners, which at the time was, a relatively new private equity backed, large corporate entity that was growing and acquiring practices, but also had a substantial physician ownership, because every time they would acquire a practice, the radiologists in that group would get reasonably large stock options. So, I got this, variant of this press release and, read through it, but really, I didn't really have any understanding of what this meant for the group or what this meant for me. And something that really kind of caught me off guard. So, I was definitely blindsided, and I was left with a number of questions. So, one thing I was wondering was, this was the first time I was really hearing about this. And so I was wondering how long had such a process been going on? And then, why was I not informed at an earlier stage, either when I was interviewing or prior to me joining? And then what are the implications going to be to my future if I want to be in this group, 20, 30 years down the road? And then also, are there going to be any immediate changes to my job? And, overall, it's like, okay, what do you do now? This is the situation. So, I talked to members of the group, I talked to the leadership, I talked to the group president, and tried to gather as much information as I could, consulted with some great external mentors. After a couple months and the group had met amongst the partners, they kind of came back to the employees and let us know some changes that would be occurring. So first and foremost, there wouldn't be any change to day-to-day workflow or productivity. So it's a very highly productive group, and it would remain that way. There would be a small raise for associates, and the partnership length would decrease from 3 to 2 years. All of which were pretty good things. But digging a little bit deeper, and kind of maybe the most important element of all this is that the new partnership was a little bit different than the old partnership. So rather than becoming an equal equity partner in the practice, partnership now entailed receiving a relatively small amount of stock in the larger entity relative to the existing shareholders who sold their shares. So that was concerning to me. And then also the projected post-buyout partnership salary was definitely depressed relative to the preceding years. And it was still, up in the air at the time, but over time definitely has seen that it has probably been, cut in the range of, 30 to 40%, depending on individuals. So there was a significant long-term, financial cut. So at this point, weighing some of these options, I tried to think about what I could do. So I interviewed with another local private practice. I interviewed with an imaging center-based employee type of position. I thought about staying, on and becoming an employee of that corporate entity. And then I also reached out to my former program director at UCLA. And my real thinking was that, if this job was presented to me with the specifications it has now before I joined, I don't think I would have jumped to accept the position. And mainly it was just because, for a group with such high productivity demands, if the productivity is in the 90th percentile, you hope that down the road the compensation mirrors that. And if it does not, then you're going to feel a little bit undervalued and maybe overworked. So, I was fortunate enough to receive an offer to return to UCLA for an academic position, and then, moved my family, sold our house, and transitioned from a private practice where I was doing everything back to an academic job where I'm doing more specialized neuroradiology and head and neck radiology specifically. So what this means for potential job seekers is whenever you're looking at an independent radiology group, consider the possibility that the group could be acquired during your partnership track. Definitely discuss the contingencies with that group as to what would happen if they did sell. I think groups are a lot more open to talking about it now because most major groups have been approached at some point or thought about it at some point, or may have already told corporate entities they're not interested. So the group may have formed more of an opinion about it. And then consider that there are some unique benefits of joining a corporate group. So, you know, my old group, for instance, now if you were to join that group, the starting salary, you know, is probably 30% higher or 25% higher, you know, for a new grad than it was when I started. And there's a signing bonus. They've definitely had a harder time recruiting people. So, you know, financially now they're having to overpay in the beginning. So there may be some opportunity for a higher starting salary. You may get greater percentage of your own subspecialty reads. And then in some markets, you're definitely going to have increased job security. You know, keep in mind that every group may have a different partnership track and partnership may mean something different. So you want to make sure you get this spelled out before you join anything. Some groups still own their imaging centers and their technical component. You may have an opportunity to buy into that. But by far the most important thing I would say is that it's important to keep your skill set broad and be ready to pivot to changing market conditions. So don't get too used to just doing one thing in case you do need to make a change related to corporatization. And your first job may not necessarily be your last job, but eventually, you know, hopefully you'll find the right landing spot. So with that, thank you for your time and attention, and I really appreciate it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me at this email.
Thank you, Arvin. Really appreciate that story, that personal story, and all of the information that you shared and guidance to the attendees here tonight. Our next person, next fabulous faculty, is Eric Rubin. Take it away, Eric.
Thanks, Bob. Just get my screen ready here. Let's see. All right. Here we go. So I want to say thank you for attending tonight, and I'd like to echo Arvin's comments by thanking Bob, Jen, and ACR staff for making this webinar series such a success, and I'm honored to have been asked to speak to you tonight. Just before I start, as was mentioned, I'm a private practice radiologist, and I am in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. Let's see if I can get this to work. Disclosures: I am a member, as are members of my group, of Strategic Radiology, and as was mentioned, I'm chair of the ACR Human Resources Commission. And another disclaimer I want to give to you: I'm here to talk to you about what works for me, what works for my group. I have no intention of disparaging any type of group ownership, and in particular, I'm not here to in any way disparage corporate ownership. I'm here to provide you with some information. It's a piece of a puzzle. Those pieces are for you to gather, and you're all doing the right thing by listening to things like this and learning and gathering as much information as you can, either whether your group is trying to decide whether or not corporate ownership is right for you, or whether you are a trainee looking to figure out what works for you in your future as a practicing radiologist. Southeast Radiology, what are we? We're an independent, member-owned group. We've been around since World War I. I haven't been around since World War I, but my group has been around since World War I. We have a 5-owner board of directors, and we take input from all of the other owners, and all of our partners maintain equal equity in the group. We have 26 members currently, 14 owners, 12 associates. Of those associates, 8 are currently on partnership track. We are a single healthcare system where, as I mentioned, in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, we service 4 hospitals, which includes a level 2 trauma center and a likely soon to be comprehensive stroke center. We also service 3 outpatient imaging centers. Our group recently expanded from only servicing part of our health system, and we now service the entire health system. We also provide a small portion of our practice. We contract with a large orthopedics group, and provide professional interpretations for the MRI studies that they perform on the MRI machines that they own. We have one major local competitor in our area. However, we are in the suburban Philadelphia region, and with that, and those of you know Philadelphia, know that there are 3 major academic institutions right downtown. We utilize Nighthawk services that we contract with. We have multiple subspecialists within our group, and an important component of what we do is that we are contracted with our healthcare system to provide professional reads. Which segues me to this. What are we not? We do not own any of the equipment that we provide readings for. So we don't own any of those imaging centers. We provide professional component reads only. We do not have any significant non-physician employees. We have a few people who do some work for us, but it is not a significant component of our business. We do not have an IT infrastructure that is owned by us, and we do not own a billing company or a portion of a billing company. Have we had corporate buyout overtures? Well, our group has really only had early stage conversations with corporate entities, and we've never shared any data with those corporate entities to make any further decisions or discussions with respect to corporate ownership. What do I see as benefits of member ownership? Ongoing distribution of our income directly to our owners. We're motivated. We succeed or fail on our own actions. And we do so democratically with autonomous decision-making within our group. We also have significant owner interface with our hospital system. Our president and vice president of our group meet on a weekly and sometimes even more frequent basis with the CEO of the healthcare system, with the CFO of the healthcare system. We strongly encourage brainstorming within our group. And that leads to success, which leads us to freely expand or contract our services as we see fit. We have very engaged younger members, and we very much encourage them and try to get them involved as early as possible in the decision-making processes that we have, and developing the concepts for new things that we can do as a group. And we expect future ownership for our younger members as they come into the group. But we'd also see, and I see, benefits of corporate ownership. You're transferring your future income risk. As we all know, we're dealing with the potential for E&M associated, or effectively a reduction in radiologist salary next year in 2021 without legislative action at this point. And under corporate ownership, you are to some extent protected from that, in my opinion. You could have access to greater range of ancillary needs, IT platforms, Nighthawk services, accounting, billing, etc. And those things are based upon economies of scale. You're potentially protected from predatory groups who might want to come in and take over your contract. And you have a national network of radiologists, and therefore you might have greater access to subspecialty reads if that's something that your healthcare system that you're servicing wants. Just a little discussion of how strategic radiology benefits us. They provide us with financial benchmarks, quality benchmarks and programs. We do have access, if we would like to expand our business into an IT platform, they could provide that to us at a group discount. And we potentially could see future shared overhead and specialty reads if that is something that we desire. So what are the risks of member ownership, of our member ownership, of my group's member ownership? Well, we have a single hospital contract. If that hospital system in any way if that hospital system goes belly up, we're in trouble. But also having one hospital contract to deal with means that we can focus all of our attention on that one healthcare system and making it a cooperative success with that healthcare system. Nighthawk is viewed as an extension of our group. So criticism of our Nighthawk reads reflect upon us, whether we like it or not. And our staffing decisions and subspecialization needs are to some extent limited by the financial resources that we have as an independently owned group. But what I will tell you is the number one benefit of Southeast Radiology's private ownership really is our culture. We are a longstanding group. As I said, we've been around since World War I, and we have maintained throughout that time a set of very strong core values. We've always been inclusive. We've always been democratic in our decisions. We've always been responsive to our owners and associates' needs and asks. And we are personally responsible to that business, and we take that extraordinarily seriously on a day-to-day basis. And we are highly integrated with our healthcare system. We do our best to put ourselves in positions within the broader healthcare system to ensure that we have high visualization and high visibility of what's going on. And we try to avoid blind spots, and we don't want the healthcare system to in any way see us as aloof. This is evident to both our members as well as to our referring providers. We see ourselves as concerned that if there's any disruption of that, then what we offer and our culture projects us, if that is lost, then what we do is lost. Now, just to give you some sense, you might be saying, what would they do in the future? And my answer is, I don't have a crystal ball. The future is fuzzy. It's nothing new. What is the 5 to 10 year horizon? It's not entirely clear. Our payment and regulation environment is in constant flux. We as a group rise and fall with our healthcare system. From a business perspective, you have to ask these questions. When are we most valuable? Are we more attractive to applicants as an independent group or owned, corporate owned? Are we at financial risk as an independent group or corporate owned? What if the corporate entity cannot retain or maintain its financial solvency? What we will do, however, is we will continue to brainstorm to strengthen our business model. And we do expect ongoing independence, but we do have to ask the question, can we afford to do it? Can we afford not to do it? And we will also remain a highly engaged, owner-directed, and culturally strong private practice group. And with that, I thank you. On here, I have my cell phone number, I have my email address, and my Twitter handle for anyone who would like it. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for sharing with us these personal details about your practice and your thoughts for people to think about. We're going to transition now to our third speaker for this evening, Dr. Larry Muroff, who is well known by many of you in the audience. It's quite a pleasure to introduce Dr. Larry Muroff. Larry?
Thanks a lot. I'd like to thank Bob and Jen and staff as well. My topic is to try to tell you a little bit more about corporatization, positives and negatives, and what might be ahead for radiology. Regrettably, the obligatory disclosure for financial or conflict of interest, I regrettably have none. So let's start with the talk and talk a little bit about national entrepreneurial radiology entities. And these are companies or entities or practices, depending on which one you talk to, but in general, they are venture capital supported entities that focus on radiology. And it's very important to understand, since the companies themselves make this point, that all of these national entities or practices are not identical. And if you're contemplating joining one, then you need to make sure that you understand and your practice understands what this entity can do both for you and to you. Now, I said that there are differences among all of these entities, but there are some common elements. And they are as follows. Most important, at least to those who have sold their practice, is that the shareholders get a large payment in return for a portion of the practice's cash flow. And if a portion of the practice's cash flow is gone, then obviously compensation, as Arvin pointed out in his situation, is lowered. And usually that lowering is for all members of the practice. Now, what promises do these entities make to potential groups that are considering joining them? And the first is, oh, you will make up the money that you have forfeited by the increased value of the shares that were paid to you, perhaps national and regional contracts that we might bring to you, management expertise and practice efficiencies, and economies of scale. I know Eric mentioned economies of scale. I can tell you that in my anecdotal but relatively broad experience, these economies of scale are nowhere near what one might expect. Some of these entities provide continuing medical education. They might offer leadership training, and they claim to have back office expertise, although I would suggest that many of the groups that these entities have acquired have far more extensive back office expertise than the national entity itself. So of course, it's reasonable to ask, have these promises been fulfilled? And I think the honest answer is it's too early to tell. But the math certainly doesn't look appealing for young radiologists, and the future seems more restrictive for potential new hires. To me, the basic question that should be asked is, if these entities really could bring new contracts and diversify income opportunities for practices, why should they have to pay practices to offer these benefits? Shouldn't practices be willing to pay these entities for those opportunities? And that, I think, is a very important issue. If these entities were doing all that was promised, then quite frankly, they could command payment rather than having to offer payment. So let's look ahead 5 years in the future and opine that there might be corporatization as a firmly established, at least alternative to practice. And if this occurs, in my mind, a very important issue, that is, a tipping point, could occur. Now, the author Malcolm Gladwell, in a book he first published in the year 2000, defined a tipping point as the moment of critical mass, the threshold, the boiling point. Now that sounds somewhat complex to me. I rather look at it as the diagram that I'm now showing you. It's, for me, a lot easier to understand what's happening. And there are two parts. There's the Sisyphus effect, and those of you that are into mythology might remember that Sisyphus was doomed to eternally having to push a boulder up a mountain. Fortunately, when it comes to corporatization for these entities, once the apex is reached, it becomes far easier for these companies to establish themselves, gain momentum, gain new groups, and become a dominant mode of practice. In the Sisyphus side of the equation, these companies have to pay handsomely and in many cases overpay for practices. They have to diligently court national organizations such as the American College of Radiology. But once that tipping point is reached, then basically you're in a situation when it becomes the norm for radiologists seeking jobs to work for one of these entities. And at that point, if it ever occurs, there will be no need to pay a premium or pay anything in order to get radiologists to do so. Now, you might say that this is somewhat theoretical, but I would argue with you that such a situation has already happened in emergency medicine. In essence, those specialists have in large part changed from physicians with independence and ownership to groups of shift workers. Now, what happens if that occurs in radiology? If corporatization does prevail, there obviously will be a lowered compensation ceiling for all radiologists. And there will be a predominance of shift workers versus independent owners. And I can tell you that under a variety of employed models, the independence, the initiative, those things that drive a physician to grow his or her practice, those things diminish substantially. Now, there is not a sole driving reason why people enter the specialty of radiology, but it is naive to suggest that money does not enter into that equation. And I think that certainly we will find over the long haul, if indeed corporatization gains traction, that a different caliber of physician will enter the specialty. I believe that eventually there'll be diminished membership in and influence for the American College of Radiology, but it still won't be over. And for those of you wondering what it is, it's you and your practice, because corporatization has been tried 2 times before. In the mid-1990s with Radiologics and Navix, and then again in the early 2000s with VRAD, Virtual Radiology, and Nighthawk. And both times the stocks rose, in one instance rather dramatically, but within a few years, the stocks experienced spectacular declines. And things don't return to normal. People say, well, that's great. If these companies go out of business, we'll just step up and do what we did before. But things don't return to normal because radiology practices are assets, and they may be sold or acquired by people with far different goals and aspirations than the entity that the group initially joined. So in conclusion, in assessing the impact of national radiology companies in a dispassionate manner, one should ask 2 fundamental questions. Would this make sense if there were no payment available for your stock? And 2, will this fundamentally change the opportunities available to those considering entering our specialty and even the specialty itself? Well, we've only scratched the surface, but in my view, our time is up. And the most important thing is question and answer. And it's time for that right now. So thank you very much. And I turn it back to Bob Pyatt.
Thank you, Larry, for those fabulous insights and projections, analysis. We really appreciate that. We're going to roll over now to Jen Nathan, who will deal with our our Q&A portion of the program. Thank you.
Dr.
Larry.
Pyatt. And also thank you to our speakers this evening, to Arvind, Eric, and Larry. Just excellent thoughts, and we really appreciate your expertise. So we are now going to move on to the Q&A session. So just a reminder, as I mentioned before, to ask a question, you go to that Zoom control panel at the bottom of your Zoom window. You click on the Q&A icon, type your question in the box, and hit submit. So we do already have a question here. So our first question is to Dr. Rubin. Please explain how corporate practice provides protection from downward forces on radiologist income. Wouldn't they just find ways to squeeze that loss out of radiologists, downsize, or have some other business maneuver to minimize impact on investors? Dr. Rubin?
Thanks, Jen. So I think what we're referring to here is that the selling radiology group is transferring some of the future risk of the unknown to the buyer. And groups that undergo corporate takeovers or corporate ownership transitions tend to negotiate an agreed upon salary for 3 to 5 years. So no, you may not be protecting yourself in perpetuity, but you do have the opportunity in those negotiations to attempt to try to at least protect yourself and your group for a period of time. And if you anticipate that downward pressure on your salaries, it's really something you want to strategically think about amongst yourselves in your planning for those negotiations, and negotiate those things at the time that you are working with the corporate entity that's looking at you, to try to satisfy yourself as best as possible.
Okay, so our next question is for all speakers. Do you have any anecdotes of any negative impact for hospital systems after a medical practice sells to a PE/VC entity?
Well, I know of several hospital administrators that I've come across in my travels to groups throughout the country that have absolutely said, we will not permit a national entity in our hospital. That said, that is not the majority perspective. So it is clear that any group that is contemplating the sale to a national entity has an obligation, in my view, to discuss this with the hospital CEO, hospital board, prior to any commitment. Often there's no problem, but in some cases there is a very vociferous kickback.
Any other comments from our other speakers?
I would just also add that I think we're going to maybe see the impact of that question a little bit later down the road. I think there are probably a lot of groups where the demographics have favored older people that have accepted a buyout that may plan to retire after that 5-year period. And then depending on how groups are able to recruit and fill those new positions in the corporate owned practices, and particularly in cities that aren't the kind of primary cities in the country that may not be the most desirable, it may be challenging for those groups to recruit. And then at that point, there may be more of an issue from the health system side in terms of not having their needs met, their needs met at that point.
Can I make a quick comment, Jen?
Yes, go ahead.
Arvid talked about these older people selling the practice, and maybe my comment is because I am an older person, but it's been my anecdotal experience that a large number of these sales are driven by radiologists in their 40s and 50s. And a lot of the older people do take a proprietary interest in their practice and want to see it succeed the way it had in the past. I don't know the actual figures. It would be very interesting to do some study, but by and large, do not think it's just the old people that are driving this. A lot of middle-aged radiologists who you wouldn't expect, who would perhaps have a 20-year horizon still with a group, are driving this movement to sell.
Mhm. That's a good point. Thank you. Yeah.
Why do you think some of the mid-career radiologists might be driving it? What do you think their motivations might be?
Well, greed for one. I mean, I think greed has a lot to do with most of these sales, because the culture of radiology, and Eric talked about culture in his group, but each group has sort of a micro culture. The specialty has a macro culture, and the culture of the specialty is we keep buy-ins artificially low and buyouts therefore artificially low, in order to attract the best and the brightest. And often we're able to do that. Some of these upfront payments can be 20 to 50 times what typically is paid both to buy in or to buy out of a practice. And that's a powerful motivator. Again, Eric talked about 3 to 5 years of salary certainty. I can tell you, once these companies hit the open market, I think 3 to 5 years may be a wishful thinking, because the companies in the past have tanked well before that, or certainly by that time.
Any other comments from our speakers?
The one thing I would say is that, and this is just this is purely subjective, is that people's lives can get expensive, and I do think that promise of some type of cushion, especially in a mid-career, and I'm not saying this is me, and I'm not saying that's anybody on this call, might be something that makes them feel a little more secure in their future. And that security they might see it as a longer term horizon for themselves.
Okay, let's move on to our next question. How can a group that is not interested in private equity reassure applicants that may be jaded / concerned about not being told the truth about potential negotiations?
Well, they can do two things. It depends how innovative they want to be. First of all, as Arvind can say probably far better than I, but clearly our survey showed that young people would prefer to join an independent practice. So I think one of the early parts of an interview with a potential hire is to make that person aware of the fact that the group is not interested in any way joining a corporate, participating in corporatization. That will go a long way in recruiting. The second thing, if you really want to think outside of the box, say, look, we're so sure that it's not going to happen that we'll give you, we will give you an equal, or we'll give you 50% until you're a full partner of an upfront payment if we decide to change our mind. I don't think you can do much more than that. I know a group, an excellent group, that did that and gave a person a 20% assurance, which is more than most any other group does, but it certainly helps with recruiting.
Yeah, I agree. Just kind of echoing that, I think in the interview, the transparency is really important. I remember when I had interviewed with a couple of groups, kind of getting a feel from the group president or the group executive committee, if they're transparent about their interest in corporatization, if they say, we've looked at it, we met, we talked to rad partners, we talked to Mednax, we went through this process, we brought it to the board, it wasn't for us, and we decided it wasn't the route we want to go. I think that's reassuring, getting that transparency. If a group has very strongly, very strong opinions against it and say, no, everyone in our group is adamant on staying independent, that's also, very reassuring. But, nothing's better than the guarantee that Dr. Muroff mentioned.
Any other comments? Okay, let's move on to the next question. Do you think it is possible for young radiologists to make an informed decision regarding the potential upside/downside of joining a corporate practice with the information available either after a corporate buy? Is the available information sufficient?
Well, I'll just say from my perspective, I don't think it was. When the buyout was occurring, there was a kind of projection of what future partner salaries would be. And that projection was based on a lot of assumptions. And I don't think that those assumptions necessarily have been met. That's not saying that in the future it may not return to that level after a renegotiation and all of that. But I think, in the immediate short term, anything you're told about projected future income, you definitely have to take with a grain of salt, because it may or may not be the case. And so I definitely didn't have all the information when I made my decision to leave, and I didn't feel like it was a fully informed decision. It was more of kind of a gut feeling that I didn't think that this was going to be in my best interest long term. But yeah.
Any other comments?
Well, I don't think that a job with a corporate entity is more secure than a job with an independent practice. I think neither can give you a guarantee on income because there are downward pressures on reimbursement. Hospital contracts are not guaranteed, but those are problems both for a job with a corporate entity and for an independent, a job with an independent group. I think you have to do your due diligence. What is the group thought? What the people in the community think about the group, what the referring physicians think about the group. Does the hospital administration support the practice? I think these are reasonable and important questions, perhaps not for the first interview, but certainly before you sign on the dotted line.
Any other comments? Okay, our next question is, would you say corporate practices have overly restrictive, predatory, non-compete covenants, such that even if they lost a hospital contract, their own radiologists would not be allowed to restaff that facility?
Well, most of these companies are in confidentiality agreements with the practices that they are talking to and in the practices they acquire. I don't therefore know what each company offers. I can tell you that it is my strong opinion that every private practice should have a non-compete clause. Now, the reason for that is probably different from what you're thinking. Yes, you can prevent somebody from leaving the practice and setting up an office down the block. But the most important reason for a non-compete is to prevent a hospital from cherry picking the practice. You have no power whatsoever in negotiating with your hospital if the hospital CEO knows that he or she can cherry pick the group. They can end the current contract and say, I'll take Jen and Bob, but not Larry and Eric. We're not sure about Arvin. We'll see what he'll work for. So the bottom line is every private practice, or most every private practice, has a non-compete clause, whether they're corporate or independent.
Any other comments? Okay, our next question is there any difference in medical legal protection in corporate versus ownership-based practice?
I wouldn't think so. But.
Yeah, that's one for the lawyer to tell you, but I agree with Arvind that, you know, at one of the economics of diagnostic imaging meetings, a lawyer said, in this day and age, you can sue a ham sandwich. So you're never going to be free of being sued. And there's no indication that any of the corporate entities or any independent practice is more or less liable to be sued.
Any other comments?
I agree. I think it's an independent factor that really you can't really take as something having any bearing.
Okay, our next question. One of the larger corporate entities has DaVita as a nationwide model. What was the tipping point that allowed them to dominate, and what can let this occur in radiology? What is the true representation model for local interests in a corporate model?
Well, again, being successful in the dialysis or renal medicine field does not guarantee a similar success in radiology. And to date, none of these entities that have been solely devoted to radiology has been successful in the long term. And in fact, not even in the intermediate term. So it's not clear what will establish this as a tipping point. I think the fact that a lot of young people, young radiologists, do not want to get involved in the corporate situation, and the fact that there is still, post-COVID at least, there will be a continued hot job market. You know, I'm not sure what will create a tipping point. What would create a tipping point probably would be if the job market turns sour and people would just be desperate to take a job anywhere they could get it. And I think that would benefit the corporate model more than in any other model.
Any other comments? Okay, our next question is, none of the speakers discussed the possibility of a second sale after the first PE firm elects to move on. Please comment.
Well, I did mention that that some of these companies can go belly up, or they can find themselves in financial straits. And both of those things have already happened. So you don't have to look too far. Now, I think, fortunately, most of these entities have been purchased by similar entities, but there's no guarantee that that will occur. And I can tell you that practices seeking to extricate themselves will find that it's not very easy.
Any other comments?
No, that was definitely a consideration I had when I was thinking about staying at my group or moving on, was that what is a group going to look like in 10 years and who's going to own the practice? And I think it's, you know, very early to tell, but at some point there's going to be an exit from, you know, most likely from, you know, from these entities to another entity, and it's unclear what that's going to be, if it's going to be better or worse for the radiologist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, our next question is, most academic practices share many aspects of corporatization. The physicians are employed, substantial overhead is deducted, and most physicians have no say in policy or economic participation. Could you comment on this viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just from transitioning from private practice to academics, I mean, I think there's some you know, pertinent points that are made in that question. And there are some similarities, particularly as academic practices get more productivity focused and get busier and busier. There are some similarities to that model. I think for me, the biggest difference is there's a certain amount of freedom and flexibility in practice that I do and in terms of the activities that I undertake, whether it's research or teaching. And then there's some more kind of longitudinal career aspirations that I think are available to me in the academic world that may not be available in, as an employee of a larger corporate entity. The other thing I think for me, one of the main feelings was, okay, now I know I've joined this academic group and I work for, the state of California. And yeah, maybe my productivity is more than the salary that I make, but I know it's still, there's a certain amount of equity with everybody else that I work with and with the leadership versus if you're in a group that is sold and then there are large lump sum payments to the existing partners, and then you stay on in that group and work there at the same productivity levels for several years, you're in some way paying back that payment to some of the other partners that were there. So there's just a certain, amount of equality that I feel is in academics more inherently than in that model.
Well, there's actually another facet of this, which is frightening and intriguing at the same time. And that is some academic centers are buying community hospitals and they're taking over radiology practices. And there are a variety of ways that can be done. Unfortunately, most of the time it's my way or the highway. To me, again, somebody who likes to think outside the box, there are tremendous creative opportunities, but as Bill Thalworth knows the saying, I feel like a voice crying out in the wilderness because nobody's interested in pursuing these. There is not, for example, any reason why you can't develop equity through side businesses in an academic center. But again, people tend to do the tried and true, even if it costs more and imposes more on other individuals.
Any other comments? Okay, so we're just a little bit past the hour and we do want to be respectful of everyone's time this evening. Any unanswered questions, we are going to submit to our speakers and they will be responding to your question offline. So we're going to go ahead and conclude the Q&A session for now. And I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Pyatt to end the webinar. Dr. Pyatt?
Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Larry, Arvin, and Eric. And thank you to our fine audience tonight for participating in this event. We'd really like you to share your feedback with us, and we will send you a post-webinar survey and a recording next week. Please feel free to share that recording with your colleagues. Coming up next for the RLI Power Hour will be the program entitled Recruiting Radiologists. This will be on Wednesday, February 17th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And you can register for this program or any other free RLI Power Hour webinars at www.acr.org/powerhour. Again, thanks to everyone for attending this evening, and we especially appreciate our faculty and your fine presentations. Thank you all. Good night.